Cope Queens, Episode 1, The Depressing Truth. This is the first episode in our 8-part series, Black and Depressed. In this episode, we discuss common misconceptions regarding depression in the African American community and share our personal experiences.
You're listening to the Cope Queens podcast, where every Wednesday, co-hosts Elaina and Tracy Hampton challenges mental health stigmas through sharing personal experiences, storytelling, interviews, and roundtable discussions about everyday life challenges. This podcast in no way is a replacement for mental health treatment. To learn more, please visit copequeens.com. Now, without further ado, let's cope together. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Elaina,
And I'm Tracy.
and today we are diving into the topic of depression, and we're going to talk about being Black and depressed, and we're going to just share our personal journeys with depression and talk about the stigma and attitudes around depression when it comes to African Americans in our communities and what we hope to see going forward in the future. So let's just dive right into the conversation. So Tracy, I know that you and I have been friends for many years, and we've been
Mm-hmm.
very open and honest with each other about our personal journeys and struggles and challenges. And we've both experienced depression, and there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely different levels of depressions and different categories of depression and symptoms and treatments, and everything looks different based on your personal situation. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that for me, the first time that I can honestly say that I recognized that I was suffering from depression, getting out of bed was a chore. And it was the last thing I wanted to do that day was to get out of
Mm-hmm.
that bed. But being a single parent, I don't have a choice. I have to get out of that bed. I have to get to work. I got to bring home that bag so that I can take care of my family.
Mm-hmm.
And other things were happening
Yeah.
during that time too, where I just lacked motivation. I lacked focus. I was isolating myself. And
Mm-hmm.
I always say I'm a person of self preservation. And so I will
Mm-hmm.
withdraw and kind of internalize so that I can kind of work through what I'm going through. And I will isolate myself from others because I don't want to be a burden to anyone else. And so I was starting to notice that I was doing that more often. But started off as a couple of days that I'm just feeling kind of down, feeling blue. But depression is not
Mm-hmm.
just something you
Yeah.
experience for
Yeah.
a moment.
I think everyone feels sad. Everyone feels lonely. And I think everyone has just those moments where you just have those normal struggles with self esteem or you may not want to be bothered. But I think depression is something totally different. I really don't remember when I first felt depressed, but I think the first time I had these symptoms and I was able to put a name to it, it had to be in my 20s. But I experienced similar symptoms as you did. I didn't want to get out of bed, but I couldn't sleep. I had insomnia. I was feeling guilty about just any and everything, things from my past, feeling guilty about normal interactions I would have with people that I would play back in my mind, but just really being pessimistic about a lot of things, trouble concentrating. Unfortunately, I wasn't losing my appetite, which would have been, great around that time. But there was just a lot of our symptoms were similar, Elena.
Yeah.
And I know that isn't the case with everyone because depression doesn't look the same for a lot of people. And maybe that's why it took me a while to really realize that I was suffering from depression. Because I believe, and I don't know if you've ever thought this, Elena, or if it was just me. I felt like if I don't feel like killing myself, I'm not depressed. I thought that's what depression was. People who were just at that point where they were suicidal or had suicidal thoughts. And because personally haven't experienced that or didn't experience that, I didn't know or feel like I was depressed, even though I had all the other symptoms.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up. So I don't know if I ever linked it to if I don't feel suicidal that I'm not depressed. I think I looked at it as I didn't have anything to be depressed about.
Yeah.
Even if we look at the lives that you and I have created for ourselves, I think for a lot of people on the outside looking in would look at us and say, well, what do you have to be depressed about?
Yeah.
But you don't know my journey. You haven't walked in my shoes. You don't know my past. You don't know my fears for the future. And so I think a lot of times when I think back to my past and when I first started to be able to name it, like you said, don't think that I thought that I was depressed initially because it wasn't something that we talked about in our
Yeah.
family. It was like, hey, if you are going through a struggle, pray and leave it up to
Mhm.
God and don't worry about
Mhm.
it. But
Mhm.
then I was noticing all I did was worry about it. And those
Yes.
feelings never went away because I
Yes.
also do suffer from anxiety. And I know that
Mhm.
I think for the most part, many of us have anxiety and we're anxious feelings at some point. So when we're talking about depression and anxiety and things of that nature, we're not talking about singular moments or incidents where that happens. We're talking about a prolonged
Mhm.
feeling of being anxious or depressed. And those
Mhm.
can truly set the tone for your relationships, your outlook on life. Like my worldview was not a good one when I was in
Mhm.
that place. And I'll be honest, I did at some points of my life have
Mhm.
some of those thoughts of maybe the world would be better off without me here.
Mhm.
And it wasn't anything that I acted on, but it was something I thought in that moment.
Mhm. You brought up a really good point, and just about it's the impact of depression on your worldview and even on your relationships. I think it mainly impacted my relationships, especially at a young age, because one thing that I suffered from was just wanting to detach myself from people, and it wasn't so much because I just didn't want to be around people, but it was just at that time I wanted that isolation.
Hmm.
And growing up, I think people will put those labels on you. Oh, she's funny acting, or she's this, or she's that, not really understanding that, yeah, it's a little bit more to it. I'm going through this right now. And at the time, I didn't really understand it, but I do believe it did have an impact on those relationships growing up. So,
Yeah,
yeah, that was a good point.
yeah, and I think too that hindsight 2020, when I look back at it now, there are a lot of friendships that maybe I didn't foster or cultivate that
Hmm.
probably would have been phenomenal friendships
Yes.
now.
Hmm.
But back then it was just like, what? I'm not feeling this. This is adding to my stress. I'll just separate myself from everyone else. And I think a lot of that came from that feeling of guilt. Like,
Yeah.
why do I don't have the right to feel bad, and there's so many other people in the world that are enduring things worse than what I'm enduring, so I should be happy, but I'm not.
Hmm.
Why am I
Hmm.
not happy? And I think a lot of times we put this expectation and these pressures on ourselves that we're supposed to just embrace the good and ignore the bad, but don't ignore the bad. I think we have to
Hmm.
address those insecurities and those concerns and that worry and get to the
Hmm.
root of it. And often I find that we find maladaptive coping mechanisms that kind of mask those feelings. So,
Hmm.
from smoking to drinking to risky behaviors like sex
Hmm.
and drug addiction, we turn to those things and we are only masking those symptoms. We're not really
Hmm.
addressing the issue. And the interesting thing is recently I was taking a look at Anxiety and Depression Association of America's website, and they have a few statistics on the site. And I know I've seen other organizations kind of repeat the same sentiment with that African Americans are 20% more likely to experience a mental health impairment over everybody else. And you
Hmm.
question like, well, why is that? But if you think
Hmm.
about just the stress from racism, prejudice, economic issues, we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other races and ethnicities and religions out there that
Yeah.
experience some of those same things, but there's
Hmm.
only so much people can
Hmm.
handle. And when you can't go to a corner store,
Yeah. Yeah.
and buy a bag of chips and make it home, and the only
Yeah.
reason why you didn't make it home was because you were black,
Yeah.
that's stress. That's
Yeah.
anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, Elena. You think about just what African Americans experience, and there's no denying right now, there's a heightened level of stress going on with African Americans being killed in their own homes,
Yeah.
African Americans being killed on their way, like you said, to the store. You're driving in your car. At this point in time, there's so many situations that we find ourselves in where we don't know if we're going to leave that situation safely. I think I was reading somewhere where they had that African American youth who are exposed to violence are at a greater risk for PTSD by maybe over 25%. So you look at that and you look at pretty much African Americans not really being able to put, not even African Americans, but people in general, not being able to put the signs and symptoms to some mental health issues together and realize and say, hey, this is going on. Maybe I am suffering from depression, or maybe I am suffering from PTSD. When you're not able to make those connections, then you're not getting the help that you need. And I think that it's really important that that's why I'm really glad that we're just doing this podcast, just bringing awareness to what depression is, what PTSD, what anxiety looks like. Because I think the more that people are aware of what it is, what the symptoms are, it may help people seek help and realize what symptoms they have or things that they're experiencing and help them go out and get the help that they need.
Absolutely. And you made me think about something when you were talking about that we don't name it, and some of us don't even recognize that that's what we're experiencing. But if you think about, I know in my family that was not a topic that I can remember being discussed.
No.
My mother and I,
Mhm.
we talk even to this day, and because my father passed when I was 9,
Mhm.
and I wish that she would have had the resources and the knowledge to have gotten me grief counseling.
Mm. Mhm.
So I truly wish that that would have been my path
Yeah.
and journey, because I think I would have learned earlier on how to
Yeah.
deal with a lot of this. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of African Americans is this is not how we do things. Like, you don't lay on somebody's couch and go whine about your problems. Like,
Mhm.
that's what you're taught. You're taught that you handle it.
Yeah.
Like, just
Yeah.
figure it out, handle it, leave it to God. But what happens when those feelings don't go away? Like, I can pray. And my mother and I, we have these conversations, and I say, I can pray about it. But
Mhm.
prayer gives me maybe the strength that I
Mhm.
can get through it, or the hope that I
Mhm.
can get through it. But I still need tools to actually get through it. I have to take
Yeah.
action, because I feel like
Absolutely.
if I just pray about it, nothing's going to change. But if I don't have the tools and the resources to even know where to begin, how do I take action?
Mhm.
Where do I get the
And
knowledge from to even know what I'm experiencing?
yeah, yeah. And I grew up in a similar household, Elena, where it wasn't discussed. It wasn't talked about. And I didn't experience the death of a parent, but and we talked about this before. I wasn't raised by my biological dad. So there was that loss, that situation to deal with. But again, I grew up in a Christian household, still consider myself a Christian. And it was that feeling, you take it to God, you pray, and then you have faith that He's going to work it out. And I feel like, yeah, you have that faith. You take it to God. You do pray. You do pray. And but like you said, faith without works. You have to do something. I feel like, yeah, you take things to God, you pray and you do what you need to do. But at the same time, you have to have just that awareness to know when you need to reach out and
Yeah.
ask for help, what things are abnormal or what things cause you distress. Because sometimes there's some things where it just really internally, like when I was going through depression, I didn't want to be in a bed. I didn't want to be isolated from everyone, but I felt like I couldn't. I felt like I didn't have the energy. So it was causing me that internal distress. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when I should have been like, hey, I need to call someone. I need someone to help me through this. So yeah, I really just wanted to just follow up on that point because I think a lot of us, a lot of African Americans probably grew up in similar households as we did. And when that isn't a topic of conversation or something that's the norm, it's something that you don't know what to do with. once you're older and you're facing those or similar situations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know even when I decided to get more involved, I searched out like resources, like where's the education at? And
Hmm.
I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't find a lot of what I was hoping. Like if you just Google depression, you find all kinds of resources, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
think in order to get the message out there, we as a culture, we as a community, specifically for African Americans, and even I will bring my Latino brothers and sisters into this as well, we
Hmm.
need a different type of awareness and conversation because it's ingrained in us that it's this life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But life is not about just being sad and depressed and anxious all the time. That's not living.
Yeah. And earlier we talked about just pushing through it. It's not okay to just push through it. Pushing through it isn't a badge of honor. Those unhealthy coping mechanisms, the smoking. There were some people I knew growing up as, and I don't know if you experienced or were around people like this, that they had to be high constantly, like from morning to night. And that's an unhealthy coping mechanism where people are dealing with things and they just feel like they just want want to disconnect somehow. But yeah, you get so used to just dealing with depression or just mental health period and coping with it in an unhealthy manner that it becomes the norm.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about the coping, and I think that we could probably for the most part track a lot of drug addiction, a lot of different addictions, and link
Hmm.
it back to some type of mental impairment because we're self-medicating.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
self-medicating to make the thoughts go away, to make the pain go away, to make the emptiness go away. And we're not doing anything but masking that
Mhm.
pain. I recently came across a book and I have not finished it, but I am very excited to finish it because it talks a lot about it only looks like we're not hurting because we do have an amazing skill of putting on our best foot and getting through the day. And I promise you, and during my worst time, most people who encountered me would have not known that something was wrong.
Yeah.
But the book is called Black Pain by Terry M. Williams. And I am definitely excited to continue. And she kind of shares her journey, but then she also, there's a lot of other African American professionals from politicians to people in entertainment that also share their journeys. And I think
Mhm.
that's the one thing that I will say that we do very well. And that is we put our best face forward when we face the public. I mean, think about social
Mhm.
media
Yeah.
recently having a conversation with the crew over at Hope Warriors, and one of the things that came out is we talked about how we sometimes represent ourselves on social media. Like some of us are living our best lives on social media, but that's not our
Mhm.
reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really good point. And both of us are right now, we're getting our master's in mental health. And one thing that was brought up in when I was in class last week, which was really interesting, was just the rise of depression and anxiety because of social media. Because you have people who are maybe suffering from depression and you're looking on Facebook or Twitter and you see people quote unquote living their best life and you're internally battling or dealing with things, and that just adds on to that. So we live in a world where people compare
Yes,
themselves to other people and what other people are doing, not really knowing that a lot of times people are only showing you what they want you to see, you know.
exactly.
So I really feel like mental health or social media has really had an impact on mental health.
Yeah, and that's why I think that sharing our journeys and sharing our stories connects us.
Mhm.
And I applaud those who openly say, like, yeah, I may look like I'm living the high life, but it takes a lot
Mhm.
to be me in a day. And not that I am living the high life. For those of you who are listening, I absolutely am not. That is definitely a goal, but that is not what's happening. But when I pitched doing this podcast with you, one of the things that I had just watched. So I am a reality TV junkie. I watch Black Ink Chicago. I watch all of the Black Inks, but in this particular one, one of the artists, his name is Four. He's also a Chicago rapper. He experienced depression and he
Mm.
had something that he needed to work through. Him and the owner of Ryan were on the Steve Harvey show. They talked about what Four went through and how Ryan supported him through that. It was one of the things that Steve brought up, that we're just told to handle it, but no one tells us how. I
Yeah.
applaud those.
Yeah.
I know that in entertainment, at least, we're starting to be more open. More books are starting to come.
Yeah.
More people are starting to speak out. I think the more that we all just say, you know what, I've experienced depression or I'm dealing with depression, whatever it
Mhm.
is, if we're open about it, I
Mhm.
think more people will be able to connect to it and realize I felt that way. Or maybe I should look into
Yeah.
this. And it's not to say that if you just lack motivation one day, I'm not telling you that you're depressed. I'm saying pay
Mhm.
attention to it. Don't ignore it. And our
Mhm.
bodies and our
Mhm.
minds have a way of slowing us down. A couple weeks ago, I had a couple of weeks where I wasn't sleeping for 3 days straight. And that was, and you got
Mhm.
on me, my mom got on me.
I had to get
And it
on
was
you.
because I had so much
Yes.
anxiety and so much stress of what was going on. I was working myself too hard and then I was becoming stressed out and I wasn't doing anything that I was trying to accomplish well. I had to take a step back. Even for my friends and family that I was connected to on Facebook, I just reactivated my account. Like I was off Facebook for a whole year because I had to work on me. And I had to do that without the distraction of what everybody else was
Mhm.
going through. May sound selfish, but like I said,
Mhm.
I'm a person of self preservation. And sometimes you have to put yourself
Mhm.
first in order to be there for everybody else.
Yeah. Absolutely. I really like what you said, and I have to echo just really thanking those people who are transparent with what they're dealing with. Celebrities or even everyday people. I know a lot of times it's necessary to put on that mask because
Yeah,
you have to go to work. You have to survive. So you have to do what you have to do and put on your mask to get through the day. But a lot of times people don't realize what another person is going through because they're looking at that exterior. And even with me, I'm just not to the point where I feel comfortable sharing that with people. And I don't go around as soon as I meet people, hey, my name's Tracy. I suffer from depression. No, but it's like for people that,
yeah,
and it's because I'm a private person just by nature. But if you're someone and we're having a conversation and I feel like I can be my authentic self with you, then I'm going to share. Yeah, I do suffer from depression. And I think the more that we talk about it, the more that people realize there isn't a face to it. It doesn't only affect this culture or this socioeconomic class. It doesn't just affect a particular group, that anyone is subjected to it. Then I think that people will look at it differently. And I just think it's really important that people
absolutely.
share their stories so that other people know that they're
Absolutely.
not
Yep,
alone.
you are absolutely correct. And so we're going to end there. And I hope that you all have enjoyed our discussion today. And if you take anything away from today, just know that depression and other mental health impairments, they do not discriminate. They don't care about your age, your
Hmm.
race, your religion, your gender identity, your sexual orientation. None of us
Yes,
are immune and none of us have to suffer in silence.
a-
We are a community
absolutely.
together and we can learn how to
Hmm.
support each other and we can be there for each other. Sometimes you just need somebody that gets it. And so I encourage all of you to
Yeah,
just learn more and be a resource for someone else, be a support for someone else, and be a support and your own advocate and a warrior for yourself. If you are interested
yeah.
in learning more or finding support, please visit copequeens.com.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Cope Queens podcast. Thank you for coping with us today, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode. Until then, connect with us on Twitter at Cope Queens.